All right, ladies and gentlemen, happy Monday. Hopefully, you guys had a great weekend. Today's our marks the beginning of our final full week of classes. So, obviously, the final countdown to comprehensive exams in summer is becoming more and more of a reality. So, what I'd like to do today is give you guys a general outline to section four, going along here with the notes, and then you'll have plenty of time here at the end of the lesson to work on some questions that are due tomorrow. So, one of the things we talked about Friday in kind of transitioning from the plantation South into the roots of the anti slavery movement is due to the demand of cotton. We're also going to see the demand for slaves increase during the 19th century and into the 1800s here. And because of that, more light is shed on this idea that slavery as an institution is ultimately wrong. More and more people, aside from the early Quakers, aside from our founding fathers we made mention of last week, when we talk about Jefferson's life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness line, it really wasn't for all. And certainly for a country that's founded on those principles, to have slaves here who are bound for life, who are forced to work against their will, is a huge issue here. Now, by the beginning of the 1800s, many northern states north of the Mason-Dixon line, we said, were already taking steps to end slavery. But we also begin to see some groups forming. One of those groups, the American Colonization Society, came up with the concept of helping to see a gradual end to slavery. And then once those slaves were freed, that this particular group would fund the transportation of those African Americans to Africa. Now, while that's nice in theory, where they would be escaping racism and discrimination, segregation that's happening in both the North and the South, the reality is that many of those former slaves would not necessarily have many ties to a continent where their ancestors were taken years ago. But the American Colonization Society overall, good to shed light on the idea of taking a modern practice and trying to do something about it, but at the same time, not necessarily effective. What became more and more apparent as the abolitionist movement got going, or I should say the anti-slavery movement got going, there was now in the 1830s and 40s a call for immediate change or immediate action. Immediate meaning right now. Not in 5 months, not in 5 years, not in 15 years, but rather today. And what is born out of the anti-slavery movement is the abolitionist movement, all right? Abolitionists wanting to see an immediate end to slavery. And I think what becomes so important to this movement is that there's certain names and faces tied to this movement overall. William Lloyd Garrison, pictured here to the right, becomes one of the most well-known and respected abolitionists here in the United States during the mid 19th century. And William Lloyd Garrison's background is important because he was a Quaker. And one of the things we had spoken about earlier in the year was that the Quakers really were the first anti-slavery group to emerge here in the American colonies. We said that, remember, this religious society of Friends believed that all people were equal in the eyes of God. So to have ownership over one's life as a slave to them was morally wrong. And based off of that, and based off of the growing sentiment that slavery should be made illegal here in the United States, William Lloyd Garrison in 1831 is going to begin to publish what became known as The Liberator, one of the most popular anti-slavery newspapers published monthly that is made here in the United States. The Liberator, its name, no coincidence, meaning freedom, so to speak, began to shed light as to why slavery as an institution was wrong and why the United States as a whole needed to look at this as a morally, a cultural issue for the United States to deal with head on here. Aside from William Lloyd Garrison having his beliefs rooted in his religious ideas as being a Quaker and all people are equal, he was also someone that did not encourage violence as a means of bringing an end to slavery. So things like slave revolts to him were morally wrong since Quakers were pacifists. They did not look at violence as a means to solve many issues here. But one of the things that made William Lloyd Garrison such a polarizing figure here during the abolitionist movement was his feelings about and not only ending slavery immediately, but what were to happen after. Now, while the American Colonization Society proposed a gradual end to slaves and relocating those free African Americans to Africa, William Lloyd Garrison, who had once been a part of the American Colonization Society, was looking to take a much different course of action. He believed that the best way to have African Americans who were freed join in the American culture was to give them full political rights, which meant that they should have the right to vote, hold office, serve on juries, and do all other things that white males were able to do. Now, not only would this be a controversial stance in the South, but many people in the North, many abolitionists who wanted to see an immediate end to slavery, felt as though that this was overstepping a line. What you would have read about at the end of section 4 is because of these beliefs, William Lloyd Garrison is in some ways vilified in the North, to a point after making a public speech about why slavery was wrong. He is beaten and dragged through the streets of Boston, literally, almost beaten to within an inch of his life here. But for William Lloyd Garrison, he becomes, like I said, one of the best well-known and spoken about figures. But there's one big difference between him and other abolitionists that are a part of this movement. While he is rooted in the idea that slavery is wrong, while he is rooted in his religious beliefs as being a Quaker, one thing that makes a huge difference is that he himself was not a slave or a former slave. And one of the best well-known people about that, the abolitionist movement, is someone that had experienced the hardships and in many ways the horrors of slavery. And that person in itself is a man by the name of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass in many ways becomes the face of the abolitionist movement in the North. Frederick Douglass, around 1811, he didn't necessarily know his year of birth or his birthday, was born into slavery on a plantation in Maryland. It was during his time living as a slave where he began to self-educate himself. While he was taught the ABCs by his slave owner's wife, he was quickly told and realized that he was not to be educated. And he recognizes at that point in time that the institution of slavery was wrong at a very early age. But self-teaching himself how to read and how to write made him a dangerous slave in the eyes of many Southerners, including plantation owners. Knowing that his life is not going to be fulfilled as a slave, Frederick Douglass plotted his escape, and at the age of 16 will successfully make his way from Maryland all the way to New York City. But once he is a freed man, and most runaway slaves would look to keep a low profile, Frederick Douglass wanted to do something much more. He wound up helping, with the help of others, authoring what was known as the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. It is widely considered one of the most popular and culturally impactful autobiographies of the 19th century. His autobiography is a book that talks about his experience as a slave and his escape to the North. While it is widely publicized and sold and distributed throughout the North, in the South, this is not a very popular book, nor is Frederick Douglass a very popular figure. Even more so than that, Frederick Douglass will help to author the abolitionist newspaper known as the North Star, similar to William Lloyd Garrison's paper, him writing articles with the help of others and talking about as to why the practice of slavery is not only morally wrong, but culturally wrong in the eyes of many Americans. Frederick Douglass also becomes a voice of action, making many public appearances to speak out against slavery, in many ways paid to make public appearances, which was unheard of during this time. Now, why could it be seen as a bad idea to make public speeches? Well, keep in mind, the belief in the South was that slaves were property, and just running away to the North, and this is going to be something that we'll talk about in Chapter 13 with the federal government getting involved, although in the North, is a slave really free? So in many ways, he's putting his life and reputation on the line when he makes many of these public speeches. After writing his autobiography, Frederick Douglass will spend time over in Europe. It is during this time that he recognizes that those of color have different freedoms in Europe based off of the United States. He becomes an activist, encouraging not only to see an end to slavery, but also catering to the idea of African Americans receiving full political rights in the United States. In the 1860s, he will be invited to the White House to sit down with Abraham Lincoln to discuss during the Civil War ways that in which African Americans could be better treated more fairly, especially in the eyes of the law, so to speak. Even after the American Civil War, until his death in 1895, Frederick Douglass is no longer just the face of the anti-slavery movement with slavery ending, but he becomes one of the earliest faces of the civil rights movement, and certainly caters to that. So this isn't the last time that we will actually speak of Frederick Douglass, as he will pop up again as being an influential part of something in Section 5. So we have a Quaker who's outspoken, we have a former slave who's outspoken, but in order to advocate real change, what we really need to begin to see are politicians who are willing to put their political careers on the line to put an end to slavery from the federal government standpoint. And that is where John Quincy Adams' greatest contributions, at least in his perspective, to the United States comes when he is going to run for Congress. Now keep in mind, John Quincy Adams is the same guy that we've spoken about earlier this year in Chapter 10. He was Secretary of State to James Monroe. He was the 6th President of the United States. And after losing the election of 1828 to Andrew Jackson, his political nemesis, he returns back to Massachusetts, but he is motivated to continue his public life. So John Quincy Adams, after serving as president, will wind up being elected to Congress in the state of Massachusetts from 1830 to his death in 1848. And it's during those spans where he becomes really one of the most vocal and recognizable names to become critical of slavery. And if you remember when we talked about political parties earlier this year, I've always said that early on, political parties wouldn't touch the issue of slavery. If a Federalist back in the 1790s were to come out and say, as a presidential candidate, that he was against slavery, then no Southern state would vote for him. So in many ways, playing the political game, Federalist Republicans, Whigs, Democrats, National Republicans, Democratic Republicans, whoever, we really began to see them always seemingly take a politically correct stance on this. As a result, though, John Quincy Adams is very critical of slavery, and is particularly the Democratic Party for those representing the South. John Quincy Adams will be one of the first politicians to advocate to have a constitutional amendment passed that would basically get rid of slavery. This brokers that idea and starts that conversation that slavery is more than ever a states' right. It should not be mandated or should be restricted by the federal government. This goes along again with the nullification crisis and what we talked about here. And John Quincy Adams will actually wind up serving one of his greatest achievements, at least in his regard, in defending those people who were on the Amistad. All right, the Amistad is a reference to a slave ship that was a Spanish slave ship that was destined to the Caribbean. The slaves on board mutinied successfully, and instead of returning the ship back to Africa, unfortunately, they wound up off the coast of the United States, which became a national story in 1841, because now the question was whether or not we should see these slaves returned to Africa. Are they considered freed African Americans here, or should they be sold into slavery, even though the slave trade technically was banned by the Constitution in 1808? Arguing before the Supreme Court, in a Supreme Court case, John Quincy Adams will cater to the idea that these men, women, and children were not to be sold into slavery, and that if they wish to stay in the United States, they should be able to. Or it would be the abolitionists in the North who would help and cater in bringing these men, women, and children back to their homes in Western Africa. And it is a case that Adams helps to win, and in many ways he looks at this as his crowning achievement as a member of the House. So we see politicians now playing a factor in the abolitionist movement. We see former slaves playing a part in the abolitionist movement. We see religious groups like the Quakers and William Lloyd Garrison playing a part. But similar to the American Revolution, It's more than just saying things. What we really need to begin to see is protest turning to action. And that's where we get the growing movement, a part of the abolitionist movement, as the Underground Railroad. When we talk about the Underground Railroad from a historical perspective, it's probably the most well known and studied part of the abolitionist movement due to its success. And when we use the phrase underground and railroad, it in many ways uh, does not come off as to what it sounds like. The Underground Railroad was neither underground nor was it an actual physical railroad. But the way that these two words came up to be a part of the abolitionist movement, underground meaning that it was secret, all right, and railroad was a reference to the code names and the secret words that would essentially go on to describe how slaves could be brought to the North. Really, what the Underground Railroad was a network of people who were both freed African Americans, abolitionists, white men and women who looked to help escape slaves. The success of the Underground Railroad truly came from those states that were considered to be border states. So when we say border state, meaning those states right along the Mason-Dixon line, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, even Virginia, were typically places where slaves would be aided and abetted off of plantations and then brought to specific stations. So just like if you were to take the Long Island Railroad, you go from station to station until you get to Penn Station. In order to get to the North and freedom, you would have to go to station, and that could be someone's home, it could be a school, it could be a church, it could be a cave in the middle of the what we would consider to be the backcountry, essentially hiding places until the coast would be clear to bring slaves from place to place, finally reaching the North and attaining their freedom. We use the phrase conductors as the people who would lead these escaped slaves to certain places. So, for example, a conductor, one or two of them, may come onto a plantation in the middle of the night. They will aid and abet a slave in leaving that plantation, and then they'll be brought to somebody's home. All right. Now, those conductors have done their job of bringing those slaves from point A to point B, and now their job is done. Okay, now at somebody's home, those slaves will stay a day or two, maybe a week, until they feel as though the coast is clear. And using the cover of night, other conductors will arrive at someone's home and now bring them 10 miles north to a church, or 12 miles northeast to a school, where they might stay again a few hours, a few days, and then eventually make their way day by day, week by week to the North. This is not something that would take, hours. It would definitely be quite the process, so to speak. And it became a very effective way of helping slaves leave their plantations. I think one of the big things to know in that idea of it being underground is that it was secretive. So I always get the question, if I were there, someone's probably thinking in their head, how many slaves wound up escaping via the Underground Railroad and how many people were a part of it. Well, again, this was in very many ways illegal. You're aiding and abetting a runaway slave, which is illegal. If you were to help, if someone were to rob a bank and you were to say, hey, come over my house, you can hang out in my basement until the coast is clear, you're now aiding and abetting a fugitive. And the same thing here with the Underground Railroad. Yes, they're abolitionists. Yes, they're helping a cause that they truly believe in. But to put your name on paper and to sign up, so to speak, or to enlist to be a part of the Underground Railroad, which is something that typically was not done. So do we have an exact number of participants? No. Do we have an exact number of slaves who escaped? Not necessarily. Some historians have said that at least 50,000 people escaped via the Underground Railroad, whereas some people actually think that it might be closer to 100,000 people. So that number has certainly varied throughout the course of history. Now, although many people participated in the Underground Railroad, the one person that really in many ways becomes the face of the Underground Railroad is a woman by the name of Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman herself was an escaped slave, and although she had reached the North and attained freedom, she did not feel as though that her job was over. So what she wanted to do was become a part of this movement in the 1840s and 50s, making nearly 20 trips back down south, putting her life on the line. She is going to actively participate in bringing slaves to the north. She recounts herself that she believes that she had helped over 300 men, women, and children attain their freedom via the Underground Railroad. So, obviously, in the North, to abolitionists, she becomes a face and a name for that inspires hope and change. In the South, she is very much vilified, vilified to a point where there is a bounty placed on her, wanted dead or alive, because she represents something that is looking to take down the very institution of slavery. So when you think about it, Harriet Tubman, the biggest name associated with the Underground Railroad, John Quincy Adams, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, all four of these figures are some of the biggest names and faces that are best associated with the abolitionist movement here in the 19th century. Certainly there's more, but those are the ones that we wanted to focus in on here in this section. So everything up to this point is on your quiz tomorrow. We're going to stop here. I know there's one more slide, but I didn't get up to that earlier today, so that will not be included on your quiz tomorrow. So tonight, study for sections 3 and 4, everything up to Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. Keep in mind this Thursday we have our Chapter 11 test. So I will be around tomorrow morning and every day after that for extra help if anyone who needs it. I know I have your tests still, so if you first just be easier tomorrow when you're in alphabetical order for your quizzes, that you guys get your tests back at that time. So you'll get them back tomorrow, and I'll talk a little bit about more about the test when I'm back in class. All right. So at this particular point in time, I'm going to ask that you start working on your homework. If you haven't submitted your Section 3 questions as of yet, please make sure that you do so now. Your Section 4 questions, as a reminder, are due tomorrow. If you're finished, your Section 5 questions are due on Wednesday. You have a quiz tomorrow. You have a test on Thursday. You have plenty of things to do. So be sure to say thank you to your sub. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to email me at any point in time. All right. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Take care.